You are sitting in the pew. You have been sitting in pews your entire life, or most of it, and you have learned to hear the words the way you hear a familiar road without really reading the signs. The pastor is midway through his sermon. He is a good man, probably. He has been doing this for 20 years, the words come easily to him. And then he says it. The church that Jesus founded. You reach for your phone. Not to prove him wrong, not out of hostility. Out of something more like reflex, in the way you might check a fact in the middle of a conversation without it meaning anything about the conversation. You open the Bible app, you type, founded, 0 results, you try, church. The results come back, Matthew 16:18. You read it. Then you tap over to Mark. You search church, nothing comes back. You try Luke, nothing. John, nothing. You look up from the phone. The stained glass is the same. The stone arches are the same. The gold cross at the front catches the light the same way it always has. Near the entrance, a small brass plaque says, established 1887. Jesus died in 33 CE. This building opened in 1887. That is 1,354 years. And somewhere in that gap, something enormous happened. Something that has been described as a founding, but may have been something else entirely. Something that is worth, at minimum, the 2 minutes you have already spent on your phone. You look back at the pastor, he has moved on to the next point. The question you are holding is still there. My name is Nathan. I spent 12 years teaching world history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. I taught the founding of the church the way I had been taught to teach it, as a settled fact. Not like the crucifixion or the resurrection, which at least had doctrinal weight around them. More like a logistical note. Jesus founded it, Paul spread it, Constantine legitimized it. The institution has been running ever since. I never sat down and counted the words. 3 years ago, I did. Not because I was looking for a fight, because a student in my last year of teaching asked me a question I could not answer cleanly. He said, if Jesus founded the church, where does he say so? I told him Matthew 16:18, the rock passage, Peter, the keys to the kingdom, the standard answer. And then, after he left, I sat with the question. Because I realized I had never actually read that verse in context with the rest of the 4 Gospels. So I went to the concordance, and what I found changed every assumption I had carried for 30 years. I want to walk you through it carefully, because the numbers matter, and the absence of numbers matters even more. The word church in the New Testament comes from the Greek word ekklesia. Strong's Concordance entry G1577, if you want to look it up. Across the entire Greek New Testament, ekklesia appears 114 times. 114 times. Now here is the count that stopped me cold. 112 of those 114 occurrences belong to Paul's letters, to the book of Acts, and to Revelation. The institutional vocabulary of the church, the word church itself, is overwhelmingly the vocabulary of people writing after Jesus died. 2 of those 114 occurrences are in the mouth of Jesus, both in the Gospel of Matthew, 0 in Mark, 0 in Luke, 0 in John. The man who is credited with founding the institution used the founding word exactly twice across 89,000 words of gospel text, both times in a single gospel, 0 times in the other 3. I sat with that for a long time before I could figure out what to do with it. Open Mark, the app you had in the pew, the one you used on Sunday. You still have it. Go to the search bar, type church, read what comes back. Now open Luke, same word. Now open John. You just searched 3 Gospels written within the same generation as Matthew, all drawing on common sources, all documenting the same ministry, the same teaching, the same person. Not one of them wrote the founding word. 3 witnesses who were there. 3 writers documenting the same scenes, the same conversations, the same road to Caesarea Philippi. Not one of them wrote it down. 2 verses, 1 gospel, 3 silences. When I first started piecing this together, I kept expecting to find something that would explain the gap. A parallel passage I had missed. A different word in the other Gospels that meant the same thing. I did not find that. What I found instead was what Jesus actually said. Over and over and over again. The phrase Jesus uses across all four Gospels, not twice, not 10 times, but more than 80 times by the count of New Testament scholars, is the kingdom of God. In Greek, Basilica tou Theou, in some passages, kingdom of heaven, which Matthew uses as a polite Jewish substitute for God's name. That phrase does not describe an institution. It does not describe a building with a brass plaque near the entrance. It describes something personal, immanent and decentralized. Bart Ehrman is a professor of New Testament studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, published by Oxford University Press in 1999, makes the argument in terms that are hard to refute. Ehrman's case is this: Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who expected the kingdom of God to arrive within the lifetime of his followers. He was not planning a centuries-long institutional structure. He was announcing an imminent transformation of the world. He was telling people to get ready, not to build. In Ehrman's words, Jesus was not anticipating a centuries-long history of the church. He expected the kingdom of God to arrive within his own generation. Think about what that means for the founding claim. If Jesus expected the world to end, or to be radically transformed being within a generation, then an institution designed to operate across centuries and millennia was not in his planning horizon. Not because he lacked the intelligence or the vision, because it was structurally irrelevant to what he was preaching. The kingdom was coming. You don't build a 2,000-year bureaucracy when you expect the kingdom to arrive before the people around you finish growing old. The shift from kingdom vocabulary to church vocabulary is not a small translation issue. It is the central structural problem of early Christian history. Jesus preached kingdom. Paul built church. And the institution that inherited Paul's framework reached back to Jesus for its founding authority. E.P. Sanders, historian of early Judaism and Christianity at Duke and Oxford, made the same observation from a different angle. His work, The Historical Figure of Jesus, published by Penguin in 1993, places the kingdom at the bedrock of Jesus's actual preaching, not as one theme among many. As the organizing category that gives everything else its shape, the kingdom is what Jesus talked about, the church is what came after. Now let me take you back to those two verses, Matthew 16:18. The rock passage. This is the one the entire Catholic doctrine of apostolic succession rests on. The one that gave every pope his institutional authority, the one that is carved into the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in letters 4 feet high. Tu es Petrus et super hanc Petram edificabo ecclesiam meam. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. In the year 1985, the Westar Institute in California began a project called the Jesus Seminar. Over a decade, roughly 200 scholars of early Christianity, New Testament scholars, historians of religion, classical scholars, gathered to evaluate each saying attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. They voted on each one using colored beads. Red meant Jesus almost certainly said it. Pink meant he probably said something like it. Gray meant the tradition might preserve an echo of his words. Black meant he almost certainly did not say it. Robert Funk, founder of the seminar, published the results in Honest to Jesus in 1996. Matthew 16:18 received a black rating. Black. The scholars concluded that the language of that verse reflects post-Easter ecclesiastical formation. That is, it reflects a community that already had a church and was reaching back to give the church Jesus's authority, rather than a pre-Easter saying of the historical Jesus. The most important verse in the founding claim did not pass the basic test of critical scholarship. But here is what I want you to notice about the textual evidence specifically, because this is where it becomes impossible to explain away. Mark records the Caesarea Philippi conversation, Mark chapter 8 verses 27 through 30. It is the same scene, Jesus and the disciples on the road. He asks them who people say he is. Peter answers. Jesus responds. The church verse is not there. Luke records the same scene, Luke chapter 9 verses 18 through 21. Same moment, same question, same answer. The church verse is not there. John does not record the scene at all. The founding verse of the Christian institution appears in exactly one of 4 gospel accounts of the same conversation. The 3 gospels that did not include it were all written within the same half-century as Matthew. If Jesus had said it, if it was a significant and memorable declaration on the order of the Sermon on the Mount or the Lord's Prayer, you would expect it to appear in more than one witness account. It appears in one. In the Gospel that scholars date latest among the synoptics, in the Gospel that borrows most heavily from Mark, in the Gospel that, when it differs from Mark, is often found to have added material reflecting the concerns of a later, more institutionally developed community. The Jesus Seminar's verdict was not reckless iconoclasm. It was the conclusion of careful people reading the evidence carefully. Before I give you the scholarship on this, I want you to picture the word itself, not the institution, the word ekklesia, the Greek word that gets translated as church across every English Bible you have ever held. Picture where that word comes from. Athens, 5th century before Christ. Free male citizens gathering in the agora, the public square, to debate laws, vote on war, govern the city. That is the ekklesia, a civic, political, democratic assembly. Nothing sacred, nothing holy, nothing connected to religion, prayer, or God. No Hebrew equivalent existed. No Jewish religious tradition of the 1st century had a word that corresponded to it. The founding word of the Christian institution is a borrowed political term from Athenian democracy, 5 centuries before Jesus was born. Used in a context that had nothing to do with faith, that is the word Matthew records Jesus saying. Not a word from his tradition. Not a word from the Hebrew scriptures he preached from. A word from a Greek city that didn't exist in the religious vocabulary of 1st century Galilee. Let me tell you about the word itself. Because even if you set aside the scholarly debate about whether Jesus said it, the word he supposedly used is worth examining on its own terms. Benjamin Merkel, in an article in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra in 2010, traces the usage of the word carefully. In the entire Hebrew Bible, there is no word that directly corresponds to ekklesia with religious meaning. The concept as a specifically religious institution did not exist in the Jewish vocabulary of Jesus' time. Paul borrowed a political word. He took the vocabulary of Athenian civic democracy and applied it to the movement he was building. When he wrote about the ekklesia at Corinth or the ekklesia at Rome, he was using a word that his Greek-speaking audiences would have understood as a kind of assembly, a gathering of a community for a common purpose. The word arrived in religious vocabulary through Paul, not through Jesus. And when Matthew records Jesus using that word, he is placing in Jesus' mouth a term that had no precedent in the religious Jewish vocabulary of Jesus' world. Jesus preached in Aramaic to Jewish audiences in Galilee and Judea, in a tradition that thought in Hebrew categories. The word for assembly in his tradition was the Hebrew kahal, not the Greek ekklesia. The word in the founding verse is Paul's word, not Jesus' word. I want you to sit with the question that comes out of all of this from the institutional side, because I spent a significant part of 3 years trying to understand not just what Jesus said, but what the institution actually is, and when it became what it is. The first Christian building we can confirm archaeologically is the Dura Europos house church in what is now eastern Syria. It dates to approximately 240 CE, 207 years after Jesus died. In the first 2 centuries after the crucifixion, the communities that followed Jesus met in private homes. Paul's letters are full of these house churches. The community meeting in the house of Priscilla and Aquila, mentioned in Romans 16 verse 5. The community meeting in the house of Nympha, mentioned in Colossians 4:15. The community meeting in the house of Philemon. Ordinary homes, people gathering around a table. No buildings designed for worship. No dedicated sacred spaces. No architecture declaring institutional permanence. That changed in the 3rd century as the movement grew and began to acquire property. The first recognizable church building is 207 years after Jesus. The first legal protection for Christianity came with Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE. The first mandated institutional orthodoxy came with the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, when the Roman Emperor convened the bishops and produced the Nicene Creed, the first universally enforced statement of what Christians must believe. The first law making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire came with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE. No buildings for 207 years. No legal status for 280 years. No enforced doctrine for 292 years. No state religion for 347 years. The institution that traces its founding to a moment in 33 CE did not have a permanent building until 240 CE, did not have legal protection until 313 CE, and did not have the governmental authority to define and enforce orthodoxy until 325 CE. It is the slowest construction project in the history of any founding claim I have ever studied, which is either evidence of extraordinary institutional resilience or evidence that what was founded in the 1st century was not yet the institution that now claims to descend from it. Those are not the same thing. You are walking out of the building, past the stone arches, past the stained glass with the afternoon light behind it, past the brass plaque near the door, established 1887. You know a number now that you did not know when you walked in. 2. 2 instances of the word ekklesia in the mouth of Jesus across all 4 Gospels, both in Matthew, both disputed. 0 in the oldest Gospel, 0 in the Gospel that was Luke's primary source, 0 in the Gospel of John. You are not angrier than when you walked in. That is not what this feels like. What it feels like is more precise than anger. A claim you accepted as structural has revealed a seam in it. You are not sure yet what is on the other side of that seam. That is going to take longer than one Sunday morning. But you have stopped treating the claim as settled. That is different from stopping to believe. You have been taught that doubt is the opposite of faith. But what you just did, looking something up, reading the primary text, noticing what was and was not there, that is not doubt. That is literacy. The founding claim requires 2 verses, both disputed by scholars, both absent from 3 of 4 Gospels, both relying on a word that was Paul's word before it was Jesus' word. You felt sitting in that pew that there was a gap between the institution and the man it was named after, between the hierarchy and the carpenter, between the building and the person whose words the building was supposed to embody. That feeling is not a spiritual crisis. It is a gap that has a measurement, approximately 347 years, running from the death of Jesus in 33 CE to the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, when the institution finally had the legal and governmental architecture to match its founding claim. The gap was always there. Now it has a number. Let me come back to Benítez, because this is the point where his work intersects with everything I have been describing, and it is worth taking the time to get it right. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years with the sources on the historical Jesus. His Caballo de Troya series is not a theological work. It is, in his framework, an investigation. He treats the question of who Jesus was and what Jesus actually taught as a historical problem, not a devotional one. His conclusion about the relationship between Jesus and the institution that bears his name is specific and, I think, impossible to dismiss once you have read the evidence. Jesus described himself, and was described by his contemporaries, as someone who had nothing to do with the religious establishment of his time. The word Benítez uses repeatedly, drawing from the documentary evidence as he reads it, is ajeno, unrelated, outside, not part of the structure. Jesus argued with the Pharisees. He drove the money changers out of the temple. He challenged the scribes and the priests. He ate with people the religious hierarchy had labeled unclean. He said, in some of the most undisputed sayings across all 4 Gospels, that the kingdom of God belonged to the poor, the meek, the merciful, and those who hunger for righteousness. He did not say it belonged to those with institutional authority. He said almost the opposite. Benítez's synthesis of this in interviews over the decades is as direct as anything I have read on the subject. The religion of the Spirit. No dogmas, no temples, no priests. That is what Jesus preached. In a 2019 interview with El Plural, Benítez was asked whether the Catholic Church is a business. He said, not only the Catholic Church. All religions are a business. He was not being provocative for the sake of it. He was making a specific historical observation. The institution that claims to have been founded by someone who drove out the money changers has been operating for 17 centuries, with the structural architecture of an organization with property, authority, and revenue. The man who supposedly founded it had none of those things. He owned the clothes on his back. He was funded by women who believed in him. He had no building. He had no legal status. He had no enforced doctrine. What he had was a message. And the message, Kingdom of God, imminent transformation. Love your neighbor. Forgive your enemies. Give away your possessions. Watch for what is coming, was almost perfectly designed to be incompatible with an institution built to last 2,000 years. Which tells you something important about which direction the trajectory was moving. The institution did not grow out of the message. The institution grew in spite of it. Here is what I am still working through. Because I want to be honest about where I am with this, and where I think the evidence leaves you with a genuine question rather than a clean answer. The institution is real. It has been real for 17 centuries. It has educated children, built hospitals, preserved manuscripts, fed the hungry, organized communities, and for many people over many generations has been the primary structure through which they experienced something transcendent. I am not dismissing any of that. What I am saying is that the claim at its foundation, the claim written in 4-foot letters in the dome of St. Peter's, the claim the pastor was making in the middle of his sermon when you reached for your phone, does not survive a precise reading of the evidence. Matthew 16:18. Black rating. Absent from Mark, Luke, John. Written in a word that was not Jesus' word. Attributed to a man who was expecting the world to end within a generation, not building an institution for the ages. The founding claim is the load-bearing wall, and the load-bearing wall was added later, not by Jesus, by the communities that came after Jesus, by people who needed the authority, by scribes and bishops and councils who understood that a 2,000-year institution requires a founder, and that the founder had to be Jesus, and that the verse had to be there. The verse is there now. It was not always there. And the 3 Gospels that were written by people who were documenting the same moment, the same conversation, the same road, the same question, did not put it there. I want to tell you about a moment in my own investigation that I have not been able to shake. I was teaching a class on early Christianity, adult education, not high school, people who wanted to think seriously about the history. One of them was a woman who had been a practicing Catholic for 60 years. She had taught Sunday school. She had served on her parish council. She knew the Bible in the way that someone knows a place they have lived their whole life, by feel, by memory, by the weight of familiar things. I was walking through the parallel gospel accounts of Caesarea Philippi, showing the class how the scene appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how the founding verse appears only in Matthew. She stopped me. She said, "Are you telling me that Mark doesn't have it?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I have been reading Mark my whole life." She was not angry. She was doing the arithmetic. She had read the oldest gospel, the source document that Matthew and Luke borrowed from, her entire life, for 60 years. And the verse that was supposed to be the foundation of the institution she had served for 60 years was not in it. She had never been told to look. Nobody had ever said, "Open Mark, find the Caesarea Philippi passage, compare it to Matthew." Not in 60 years of Sunday school, not in 60 years of homilies, not once. She was not asking me to tell her the church was wrong. She was asking me why she had never been invited to look. So I did not have a good answer. I still don't. The Jesus of the Gospels never asked anyone to build anything. He asked people to love their neighbors, forgive their enemies, give away what they owned. Watch for the kingdom, which he said was coming soon, within the lifetimes of the people standing next to him. The building came from someone else. The hierarchy came from someone else. The founding claim, the load-bearing verse carved in 4-foot letters into the dome of St. Peter's, that came last of all. You can read the Gospels and find that man, he is in there. The institution that grew in his name 3 centuries later, with his vocabulary replaced and his message institutionalized, that is in there too. My name is Nathan. This is Forbidden Gospels. I have been sitting with these numbers for 3 years. The count is the same every time I run it. 89,000 words in the 4 Gospels, 80+ uses of the phrase Kingdom of God, 2 uses of the word church, both in Matthew, both rated black by the Jesus Seminar, both absent from the 3 other gospel accounts of the same scene. 1 word borrowed from Athenian democratic vocabulary, not from the religious tradition Jesus preached in. No building until 207 years after the founding. No legal status until 280 years after the founding. No enforced doctrine until 292 years after the founding. No state religion until 347 years after the founding. 2,300,000,000 people today identify as Christian. The institution that represents them traces its authority to a verse that the oldest gospel did not record. I am not going to tell you what to do with that. The numbers are there. The parallel passages are there. The absence is there. You can open Mark right now. You know the app. The search works the same way it did on Sunday morning in the pew. Type church, read what comes back. That is the founding document. That is what the earliest witness preserved. You decide what to do with this.